Amidst a continuing flurry of diplomatic activities, most recently over the weekend in Miami, where the United States has been talking with both Russia and Ukraine, trying to find an end to the war. In reality, we are, at best, you can say we're just spinning our wheels, and at worst, you can say everybody's working towards no solution. And everybody's talking about just accomplishing objectives that they want, almost at the exclusion of what anybody else could. And the net, what anybody may intentionally mean, the bottom line is we are no closer to any kind of a peace than we were before. And I'm talking about when Trump was inaugurated in January. You can say to the Alaska summit that was earlier this year, or now this latest flurry of activity that's going on, and Trump's phone calls, the visits with Witkoff, the meetings in Europe, the meetings in Miami, multiple meetings in Miami, in Florida. All of this stuff is going on to just basically spin their wheels, and we're not even moving towards a peace. It's understandable that very often when you're talking about negotiations, things can extend out. They can take a long time. But right now, people are just posturing. And the one thing that really gets down to how wars are resolved, how they come to a negotiated end, it almost always comes when at least one side, and primarily one side, is exhausted and recognizes they can no longer achieve any objectives they want by continuing to fight. Once they recognize that, then negotiations become possible, because people are willing to make concessions that are acceptable to the side on the powerful balance of the ledger. And then the other side can say, all right, well, those concessions are lower cost to me to obtain my objectives than continuing to fight. That's where you come a chance to have a negotiated settlement. We are nowhere near that right now. Russia is in a position of military superiority, economic superiority, production superiority, and there is no way they're going to compromise on anything that they have. But on the other side of this ledger, you have the Europeans, you have the Americans, and you have the Ukrainians. And so far, the Americans are kind of ambivalent, if we're just being honest about this. Trump says a lot of times, I don't want this war to go on. I don't like the killing. I think that's rhetoric. You have the European Union totally disconnected from reality, saying we don't want this war to come to an end because we want Russia to continue to be hurt, and we cannot even contemplate the possibility of it being acknowledged, even if they don't say it out loud, but if it being self-evident that they have lost and failed, and we are no longer on the dominant position where we've been for the past, 80 or so years. And then you have the Ukrainians who are even more detached from reality. And now then, because of domestic issues, and I just think the inability to have the flexibility of mind in the Ukrainian leader and many inside of Ukraine, not just Zelensky himself, but they can't even contemplate it. So they're still pretending and making demands as though they were on the superior end, not the inferior. And I'm just going to show you a few things here today of why I come to this conclusion that we are nowhere near a negotiated settlement, no matter what anybody's saying out loud, and why the likelihood is just the continuation of the way things have been for many, many months now, with the Russian grind to the west. And that will continue until that condition that I described is finally met, when the lower side comes to the conclusion on their own that they can no longer maintain the fight, and that to continue on will be in their negative self-interest. They're not there yet. Here's some examples. Now, overnight, there was another big issue in Moscow, and for the third time in 12 months, there was an assassination of a senior Russian general. A car bomb killed a Russian general on Monday, the third such killing of a military officer in a year. Investigators said Ukraine may be behind the attack. No kidding. Lieutenant General Sarvarov, if I'm saying that right, head of the Operational Training Directorate of the Russian Armed Forces General Staff, died from his injuries. He was a fairly senior ranking person, and he was involved with a lot of the training. So he was involved with a lot of the preparation for the combat and the conflict that the Russian forces have been doing for quite some time. So he was just another person that was killed. Now, the previous ones, it was self-evident just on the surface of it. Obviously, nobody else is going to assassinate a Russian general in Moscow. Some of the previous ones, I think the second of those three was actually acknowledged eventually by the Ukraine side. So far, they haven't acknowledged this one, but it's pretty self-evident that that's exactly what it was. This actually has a number of people in Russia pretty upset because they're saying, how is it that a senior ranking member of the Russian general staff, in the light of already three total assassinations prior to this, there was also the daughter of Dugin, one of the intellectuals in Russia, somebody that's not liked in the West. He was not an official member of the government, but his daughter was assassinated by mistake, it appears, when they were trying to have a car bomb to kill him, and they got her instead when she was driving his vehicle. So this just is a long history of. I think now, on the one hand, you can just say this is just Ukraine killing legitimate military targets. That's there's certainly one way to look at it. You can also say that they're trying to provoke the situation. They're trying to provoke a response from Russia. Russia seems to be, and while there's a lot of people that are unhappy about this and the lack of security among senior officials in Moscow, and quite frankly, I'm also surprised because this guy didn't have any security detail, was just driving his own vehicle to work, etc. In an environment when they've already been multiple assassinations this year in the capital city. It seems like they would have been taking a little bit more precautions. They probably will after this, but be that as it may, the Russians are probably going to do what they said they have done in the past. They're probably not going to take a big provoke. They're not going to take this as a provocation and take some big splashy response. I think that that's part of what Ukraine wants. There's been some rumors for the past several weeks, especially that Ukraine was planning on doing something that would be provocative to the Russian side, that would cause them to have some big, huge counterattack and some big splashy response that then the Ukraine side would go, oh my God, look at what the Russians are doing now. Please, we need your help, etc. Something to that effect. I suspect, don't have any personal evidence, I don't have any sources to this effect, only from what I can gather from the Ukraine side. I think that that was their intent. I think that when you assassinate somebody in the capital city of Moscow, it was kind of an in-your-face insult, and they hope, I think, that Russia will do something equally splashy on their side that then they will use to say, this just shows you the nature of the evil empire, etc. Now, no one that'll work, by the way. If Russia did that, it would work among many in the West. Because when the news would come out that someone was assassinated in Kiev, only thing anyone would report was how awful and heinous the Russian side was in doing this. No one would talk about that this was a tit for tat, which Russia's quite good at, and historically precludes or proclivity that they do this a lot. No one will talk about that because that's always the way this works. They would only talk about the act itself, and then they would say, see, this is why we need to do X, Y, and Z, whatever, you fill in the blank. Continue to support Ukraine. I suspect, though, that Russia will do what, at least it's been reported that they have done on some of the previous ones, which is that they will strike back, but they will do it in one of the Russian media outlets that I saw this morning. Said they'll probably do it along the Mossad model, where the Israeli special forces never forget an insult, never forget an attack, but they also do it covertly and subtly. It's very painful to the recipient, and they know where it came from, but it's not a big splashy thing. It's not something where the fingerprints are easily tied back to them, etc. And they say that some of the Russian strikes that have killed, they said, senior military NATO officials, they have claimed over the years with Kinzhal missiles or other kind of hypersonics, something to that effect. They said that those are some of the things that they would do in response. They may do the same thing here again, because one thing Putin has been pretty good at is not falling into the traps set by the West, at least to a certain extent. Some things he can't avoid. And of course, they're going to characterize anything that Russia does however they want, and you can't do anything about that. But I think that's probably one of the things that the Ukraine side has intended. We'll see how that plays out. But in any case, it certainly is a military target that was hit in Moscow by a country that's at war with them. So just in terms of military, you really can't blame that. But like everything else, it matters what the outcome is. And if you take an action that you can justify under the laws of war, you also have to be prepared for the consequences that would follow. And one of the things we love in the West, and Ukraine is in this category at the moment, is that we want to do things and we don't want any consequences. We don't want there to be a result. We just want to take action, and then the other side cows and falls down. Certainly not going to happen here. I don't know what Russia's going to do, but I feel pretty confident that they're going to do something. Putin himself has said the last provocation that came, which is the attack of the civilian oil tankers and the destruction by drones and sea drones that Ukraine has been using to hit civilian tankers. Putin said just a few days ago there would be a response from that. We're still waiting for that too. But you can imagine this is going to fall into that same category. In the West, however, there is thinking that this is a pretty good idea. And along the terms of tit for tat and what's good for the goose is good for the gander, let's consider something. Here is how Times of London this morning characterized that attack.
I think also the idea of striking people actually within Moscow is a good one for as far as the Ukrainian strategy is concerned, because Putin's great aim, I think, has been to insulate Moscow, insulate St. Petersburg, which in Russia are the two places that really matter from the war. Yeah. And so, be it the occasional drone strike that finds its way to Moscow or an assassination like this, it's a way of sort of saying to the Muscovites, hey, this war, you're in this war. You're not just spectators watching it for a long way away. Double win for the Ukrainians.
Yeah, double win there. Now, one wonders how much this fellow here and the Times of London and the whole intelligentsia and elite in London writ large would say, what, if someone is assassinated next week in Ukraine, would they say, well, it's a good idea from Moscow's side. We don't like Moscow, so we don't think it's good for the Ukraine side, but I get it. We cheered when it happened to the Russian side there so that they could see that they're in this war. I wonder if they'll cheer that if it happens anywhere else in the West. If Russia decides to assassinate some senior military official that's helping kill Russians through the vehicle of the Ukrainian armed forces, I wonder if they would think that was okay. I think you know the answer to that. Here's the problem with that. I think that it would be a bad thing too, because that could potentially expand the war. But when we're cheering the concept of assassinating somebody in another capital, and obviously there's been lots of situations where, with the Israelis, for example, where they were assassinating leaders in Iran and elsewhere. And, so far the wonder is what's going to happen if it happens back to the side that we like is doing it. Will we cheer that on? Will we say, fair target, it's a fair military target? Will we say that? Or will we then, of course, condemn? That's one of the problems that we have. We have such a horrific double standard. If the West said, look, that's a valid military target, it's that the Russians and the Ukrainians are fighting a war, a military general was killed in the capital city, it's fair game. And then if the Russians do a tit for tat and that there's a Ukrainian general that's assassinated somewhere by whatever means inside of Kiev, if we said, well, that's regrettable because we like this side, but it's a fair military target, I find it very unlikely, very doubtful that anybody in the West would say that. In fact, I think what we would do is the contrary of say, those animals, I can't believe they did that. That violates X, Y, and Z. You'll fill in the blank. You can make up something. It doesn't matter. They would say something. And instead, we just look stupid. We look like to the rest of the world this intentional or this expanding double standard that we have, which has been evident for a long time. It's wearing thin, I've got to say, because it's even to some in the West now, a growing number in the West, they recognize these double standards and the moral strength with we're trying to hold and trying to have is just being continued to be undermined. And you can't hold one thing for one side and then hold the other side as a demon when they do the exact same thing that you just defended. It's got to be one or the other. It can't be the opposite in either direction. Because then you just undermine yourself. You can say it, and a lot of people wouldn't be surprised by it, but what that does is that renders other things you say impotent. No one's going to listen to a word you say. You try to bring up some morality. You try to say something about the rule of law. You get mocked. No one's going to listen to it. And then you definitely don't have any influence. You don't even make it hard for the other side to take action because they have to worry about looking bad, because now then they see that you've made a mockery of the rule of law and of international justice or any kind of fair statements. And so they're not even going to worry about trying. Ergo, our side could suffer because of the double standard that we have shredded in our own standards, in our own statements. That's kind of where it is on that. Back to the theme of how this war is not being solved. So, of course, Trump has been in office since the beginning. He's been using the rhetoric of trying to find a negotiated settlement. He has been trying. He's had all kinds of shuttle diplomacy, sending people back and forth. He himself has talked to Putin in person, on the phone, sent Witkoff, etc. So Trump deserves credit for trying to get this done. But to show that there is no interest whatsoever in Europe and in Ukraine to have this done, you just had over the weekend the European Union came up with $90 billion to give to Ukraine. We covered some of that over the weekend about what that meant, where the money came from, and what that's going to mean for Europe. It's going to be a real problem for them. But what the bottom line is, and what Zelensky said today, is that this gives him freedom and some breathing space to not have to worry about a negotiated settlement, but instead can focus on the next 2 years of fighting a war, as he said here.
Ukraine will receive at least 45 billion euros annually over the next 2 years. And these funds can be repaid only using Russian funds. Russia must pay for its war. 90 billion euros is a real financial security guarantee for everyone in Ukraine. I thank Europe's leaders, Antonio Costa, Ursula von der Leyen, and all the leaders of the states who supported us. We continue working to ensure that all Russian assets are directed toward real protection against Russia's war and toward rebuilding our state.
Literally no conversation or talk at all about a negotiated settlement. No talk at all about how can we bring this war to an end. The only time he does mention any of that stuff, which has been consistent, I mean, you got to give him some credit for at least consistency. He's really never wavered in his positions. And that is, we want an end to the war on our terms. Used to be that he was going to go back to the 1991 borders. He finally at least resolved that impossibility in his mind. And then he said, all right, well, the current line of contact, that's where we'll go. No more. Nothing in the Donbass, nothing in Kherson, nothing in Zaporizhia. Definitely no demilitarization, no denazification. Other than that, sure, we'll stop the war right here, because what he wants then is the path which Mark Rutte has encouraged him by still not taking NATO off the table, as he repeated just a few days ago, Mark Rutte, that the Washington summit in a year and a half ago, where it said that it was inevitable that Ukraine would be in NATO. He did not take that off the table. He said that's what we said then, and it still exists today. So that's feeding Zelensky and telling him not to make any kind of a negotiated settlement. And so now he's talking about, great, we have this money. I don't know how Europe is going to pay this back. I mean, they didn't steal the Russian assets for now anyway, because they calculated the cost correctly, by the way, was too high for Europe. And there's a lot of things that Russia could have done and would have done had that happened. But now then they said, all right, well, the Europeans were put into a position and said, all right, well, now if we don't pay for it ourselves, he can't survive. I think it was up to April, the state literally would collapse in Europe and Ukraine if they didn't have this loan, if they didn't have this $45 billion for this year and 45 for the next year. I mean, they wouldn't be able to pay their military salaries, and nobody is going to fight if they don't even get paid. Or they couldn't pay government salaries, so the government couldn't physically function. I mean, the state would literally collapse if they didn't. So they said, well, now we have to. And of course, now then they had to borrow it, because they don't have, 45 billion euros just kind of hanging around with nothing to do, and say, hey, sure, let's pop it over here. This is all net negative. They don't gain anything from it. You can't even say that they gain something in military industrial capacity, because primarily that money will be going to pay salaries in Ukraine, and whatever's left is to buy weapons and ammunition from the United States. So it helps us in our economy. We're actually making from it in our defense industrial base. Europe's hardly gaining anything. It is all a loss. It is a net loss. They're not going to get their money back, because it's in technically a loan, but they said the loan will be paid by Russia in reparations, not Ukraine. They said Ukraine wouldn't pay it back until the war is solved and Russia is forced to pay reparations, i.e. Ukraine will never pay this back. So Europe will never get its money back unless they do later on what they said they wouldn't do now, which is steal the Russian assets. Short of that, they're just going to eat the loss. So that's going to continue to hammer and deepen the economic problems in Europe itself. So the unwillingness to acknowledge reality in the battlefield is now having economic ramifications for Europe on their economic bottom lines and going forward. We'll see how all that's going to play out. Well, as it turns out, Europe is not alone in this. Ukraine is not alone in this. There are certainly voices in the United States that are also just as detached from reality and seek, as it's going to turn out, to not want to have a negotiated settlement. Here is I guess it was yesterday, Jack Keane went on American television here to explain several factors he thinks that need to go into find a negotiated settlement. And in the process, he listed number 2 in his goals about how a negotiated settlement needs to come to fruition.
Comprehensive security guarantees have been developed. The United States has had a part of that, the Ukrainians have had a part in it, and the Europeans. And what am I talking about here? The United States command and control of a multinational force that has an air, land, and sea component to it, with security forces obviously on the ground inside Ukraine, air power overhead, and also ships in the Black Sea that are making certain that there's no incursions there. This is to enforce a peace deal, and Ukrainians need that to deter Russia from reattacking.
Okay. Let's understand what's being said there. This is Jack Keane on American television, and a figure that you see because we use him a lot. He is constantly in front of the American audiences. He is constantly talking to people inside the Trump administration, pushing them further and further away from a deal that makes any sense and trying to build up public opinion support for this idea here. Understand what he's saying. Let's be clear on this. What he is laying out there is something that literally guarantees that Russia will never agree to a term. He said there at the end of that clip that these terms that he just laid out are something that Ukraine needs to have security going forward. Going forward, what that means is after a negotiated settlement. Ergo, that needs to be what he's claiming there is what he wants to be the terms that meet the ceasefire, not ceasefire, the negotiated end, the end of the war. And then those terms will prevail forward. But in order to get there, folks, you have to have concurrence by all parties. Europe, Ukraine, the United States, and Russia. Do you see any prospect on this earth where Russia is going to agree to an American or a European boots on the ground, planes in the air, and ships in the sea? And that's going to provide some sort of guarantee, something even like Article 5 for the future if Russia and Ukraine fight another war as defined by Ukraine, because that's who would declare it and trigger these mechanisms that he's talking about in place. There's obviously no chance on God's earth. There is no reason why any sane person from a position of military superiority, economic superiority, production superiority would ever agree to the very issues that led to the war in the first place to be solidified into an agreement. Think of how insane that is. Putin just said over the weekend, this past Friday, I think it was, in this big end-of-year press conference that he always does this marathon 4-hour situation, where this was one of the key topics, and he had repeated what they've been saying nonstop since 2022. We'll have a negotiated settlement when the core issues are resolved. The core issues were demilitarization, denazification, and neutrality, no NATO. And you literally want to reinsert all three of those. So you guarantee, if anyone pursues this, and the Europeans certainly are, they are intentionally, knowingly trying to insert terms that they know that that the Russian side will not agree to. They know that. And Jack Keane's not alone in this. He is also supported by one of Trump's good buddies, his golfing buddy, Lindsey Graham, who now says, and this is, I think it's just yesterday, he says, by the way, if that deal that Jack Keane just said, if that doesn't happen, if Putin doesn't do the insane and agree to something to his own harm from a position of strength, then he says Trump should do this.
Putin says no, we need to dramatically change the game, including giving Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine to hit the drone and missile factories that exist in Russia. I would go all in if Putin says no.
You know what? I believe him. I believe he would go all in because he is insane. Lindsey Graham has lost his mind. Now, I'm going to do, probably not today, probably tomorrow, I'm going to do something that shows in context and kind of loop together a number of comments that Lindsey Graham is saying on a number of different topics that shows this is one of the most, his ideas anyway, are among the most dangerous in our nation and could potentially, if acted upon, cause the most harm to ourselves and to other people around the world. This man is a war luster of the top order. Nobody outdoes him in lusting for war and openly declaring he wants to use military force on literally everyone for the benefit of what he thinks the United States should do, not defense of our country, not to push back on someone who wishes us harm, just as a normal tool of state policy to obtain a desired outcome. It's as simple as that. And of course, not only is it morally reprehensible and foolish, it's also stupid, because they won't work. What do you think, Senator? What do you think is going to happen if we give long-range tomahawks? Number one, do you think that that's going to have a military result, that somehow a handful of long-range missiles, and that's all we would have, a handful of long-range missiles are going to bring Russia to their knees, and then they're going to do what Jack Keane says? Do you think that? Do you think that you could have these and that Russia would literally do nothing, that they would quake in their boots and that they would bend their shoulders and bow submission to Lindsey Graham and Donald Trump? Do you think that's going to happen? And then you say, I would go all in. What does that even mean? Where do you see all in? Do you mean troops on the ground, American troops on the ground? Do you mean American planes in the air, American ships in the sea? Are you talking about going to war against a nuclear country that would crush us unnecessarily, that would get us into a war we should never fight, have no need to fight? We are not threatened at all from the Russian side, air, land, space, or sea. None of it. And you want to say I would go all in, that would force Russia into a fight against us? Now you see, I'm pretty animated about this, because how insane what he's saying is, and yet it gets this kind of conversation. Hardly anyone ever pushes back on him. They just put a mic in front of his face and say, yeah, say it. And believe me, as you'll see when I put this stuff together, there's been a lot of mics placed in front of him, and almost no one pushes back on him. Well, we are, because we're unintimidated and uncompromised, and we will tell you the truth no matter what it is, because you need to know how dangerous this is. This is not just rhetoric. This is not just, eye rolling, oh, Lindsey Graham again. No, if acted upon, again, like Gary just showed you, this is Trump's golfing buddy. And we know that Trump is often very susceptible to whoever talked to him the last. And this guy obviously talks to him a lot. He was just in Israel this past weekend. He was talking to Benjamin Netanyahu. There is a possibility that we could again use force against Iran. That case is definitely being made. He made it. So we know that Trump has already acted on that once, and Lindsey Graham was 100% behind that. So there is some track record that he has some influence. This needs to be pushed back. Altogether, net, you see all of this. There is no prospect for this war to come to a negotiated settlement anytime soon. And we can, and we'll show you. Actually, this afternoon, I'm in the context of this war not coming to a diplomatic end, I'm going to show you what current things are, both on the Ukrainian, European, and Russian side altogether, about how the discontinuity between this, with Colonel Jacques Beau this afternoon, actually not long from now, about an hour from now. We called it crash and burn Ukraine-Russia diplomacy, just heading to the rocks. And of course, you're definitely going to want to tune in to hear Colonel Jacques Beau, because he's been sanctioned by the European Union in just this fraudulent kind of way that exposes just how just vacuous and empty our morality is these days. We call ourselves the defenders of freedom and democracy and free speech and all this crap. And then because we don't like what someone's saying, especially when it's factual, he's actually impugned. Not just impugned, but he's actually had assets frozen. He can't travel, etc. I mean, there's some real causes and costs to him on this. And we're not going to be cowed. He's not going to be cowed. We're going to put a mic in his face and let him speak for himself. Not going to want to miss that. About 1 hour from now on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive. We appreciate you very much, folks. Ask you to like and subscribe if you haven't done that. And look forward to seeing you in about an hour with Colonel Jacques Beau. See you then. You know, I don't try to talk you into buying gold or tell you how to run your stock portfolio, but there is a way you can help us. Subscribe, hit that like button, and share this with somebody you love.